right, so don't forget, of course, this is the last day of the units. This is only 4 days, and we'll start the new unit tomorrow. The bell ringer, of course, was about what we covered yesterday, what happened during the communist regime and as Stalin took over after the Civil War. And hopefully you're able to answer the journal, including why do many say this period was World War III. So today we will talk about the last of the notes for this unit, and we'll start with the conferences. And we talked a little bit about these and their impact on Europe earlier. And these, of course, range from 1941 to 1945. And so while these conferences were meant to compromise and work together, they often led to suspicion or doubt. Led to doubt. And once again, the first one of these, Russia, since we're talking about mostly the Russian perspective here, the Russians were incredibly suspicious of the Atlantic Charter because it was just a discussion between Britain and the United States about what to do with world policy going forward. So they kind of wondered, why weren't we included in this? Are they going to try to keep us out of making world decisions? Are they going to try to control more territory? So even though the Atlantic Charter was meant to stop things like imperialism that led to World War II, Russia believed, of course, that it was going to do the opposite, that Britain and the United States were going to try to control the world. And then there was Tehran, Tehran. And from the Russian perspective, they had to beg the US and the UK to invade Europe. So they didn't necessarily look at, oh, look, they finally agreed. They kind of looked at it from this perspective. We had to beg them to do this. We had to ask them constantly. And finally, at this conference, they finally agreed to invade Europe, which, of course, eventually led to the D-Day invasion. But from Russia's perspective, they should have been willing to do it all along. They shouldn't have waited for such a long time. And so going into Potsdam, the Potsdam Conference, which is spelled Potsdam, that's Potsdam. Going into Potsdam, Russia took the perspective, we need to get as much as we can. We can't trust the other side. They're out to get us. We need to look out for our own interests. Remember, one of their interests was establishing the buffer zone. So they wanted to keep as much territory as possible. And remember, their other goal was to punish Germany. So at this conference, they proposed dividing Germany, and they would get the eastern part. So they would punish Germany by dividing it, and they would get to keep the eastern part, which, of course, increased the size of their buffer zone. And since they were successful at getting that agreement at Yalta, which is spelled Yalta, the Russians then wanted to, of course, make sure that they were going to control Eastern Europe. So Eastern Europe was going to stay under their control. So all of this red territory up on this map, this is Germany. It's just a tiny chunk here. But all of this would remain underneath Soviet control. So the Soviets will be able to install their own governments. They'll be able to control the people there. They'll be allowed to have their troops stationed there, and so on. And probably leading to more problems in the future is that the city of Berlin, which is the capital, will also be divided. It's completely surrounded by Soviet territory, but even the city itself is going to be divided into parts. And of course, everybody should have known what was going to happen. The red part is going to be communist. No elections, no voting, no freedom of speech, no freedom of the press, no people owning their own businesses, being allowed to make their own goods and services. And then in these three sections, there's going to be democracy and all kinds of different products sold. People can buy different appliances for their kitchens and different kinds of clothes and all kinds of other stuff. And people can become millionaires and they can become rich off their success. So where do you think everybody wanted to live? They wanted to live on the western side. So there was a flood of people from one side to the other. And that will cause a problem later on. And then in the background, of course, there was the formation of the United Nations. So, of course, we hoped this would bring peace. We believed people would go there to resolve disputes. So, resolve disputes. They would go to the UN and argue instead of going to the battlefield and firing at each other. So, resolve disputes. And to persuade the Soviets into being part of this, the Soviets asked for something in return. There needs to be some kind of higher power, and we need to have a veto over it. And so that's exactly what happened. And I'll put the list of countries up here. The Security Council was proposed, and it's the highest body, basically the most important one. And permanent members have veto power. So they added the United States, of course, the Soviet Union, and because they did a lot of the fighting in World War II, France and Britain, and then lastly, China, because it did have over 1 billion people, or was about to have 1 billion people, so they thought it should be there as well. And this still exists today. Even today, if the Security Council, for instance, we're always worried about Iran developing nuclear weapons, and if the United States, through the UN, makes some kind of treaty to try to stop them from doing that, if the China or the Soviet, or now it's just Russia, not the Soviet Union, if either of them veto it, then it's not going to happen. So all of these countries up here have veto power. There are other temporary members on the Security Council. There's dozens of them, but these are the ones that matter up here on the screen. So that would be, once again, USA, USSR, today it's called Russia, France, Britain, and China. And of course, some other countries are bothered by that. Poorer countries, countries with less people. India has 1 billion people, but they're not on the permanent Security Council. So there are some people that don't like this today. And then, of course, there's the atomic bomb. Now, of course, the main reason for using the atomic bomb in Japan was to bring World War II to an end. In some of the last battles, the Japanese had even convinced the civilians, even children, to fight and carry things like grenades. And they also were willing to fight to the death in kamikaze missions, committing suicide. So we believed if we had to invade Japan, it would result in the deaths of probably a million or more Americans and then a lot more Japanese people as well. So we decided to use the atomic bomb. Another reason why we might have used it is because we wanted to show how powerful we were, so that way the Soviets wouldn't try to take over some of the Pacific like they had Eastern Europe. So the Russians were worried that the next bomb would be dropped on them. So there are kind of two reasons. One was to stop Japan. The other might have been to try to intimidate the Soviets. And by the way, a lot of people say this is controversial and maybe we shouldn't have done this because it was terrible. It killed so many people. We killed a lot more people just using regular bombs. Tokyo, we dropped an early form of napalm, which is a type of chemical that burns really hot. And over 2 days, we burned 100,000 people alive in Tokyo alone. So people say, oh, we shouldn't use nuclear weapons because it killed a lot of people. We killed a lot more people other ways than this. It was a pretty deadly war. And then, of course, the person who everybody knew all this tension was there. Everybody knew there was paranoia and fear on both sides. But the first person to really announce it was Winston Churchill when he gave what was called the Iron Curtain speech. And he meant the Iron Curtain because he was talking about that border in Eastern Europe. You know, the stark contrast between the red countries that were communist and those that were democracies. So when he meant Iron Curtain, he meant the division between the two sides. And in this speech, he basically warned Stalin, we're watching you. And he also said the U.S. had a duty toward democracy. So Stalin, we're watching you. And the U.S. has a duty toward democracy. Well, it was a nice speech, but it probably didn't help the situation because if you come right out and say Stalin all this time was paranoid, and now Winston Churchill says, "Hey, we're watching you," it doesn't really necessarily help improve the situation at all. But of course, Harry Truman took this seriously, and so he developed the Truman Doctrine. Which, of course, was to contain communism. Contain communism. Now, of course, you're probably familiar with the belief that if one country fell to communism, others would. It's called the domino effect. But from the Russian perspective, when they saw this, it looked like the same thing, but the opposite. That we were going to try to spread democracy and capitalism. And once it went to one country, it would spread to another. So they saw a domino theory too, but from the opposite direction. Then there's the Marshall Plan. This is named after the Secretary of State, the Marshall Plan. This is when the U.S. spent money rebuilding countries as long as they rejected communism. Rebuilding countries as long as they rejected communism. And it was a risk, and not because of Stalin was going to invade. In Turkey, Italy, for instance, there were active communist parties, and they were hoping through elections they would be able to win. So it wasn't just because we were worried about the Soviets invading either. But from the Russian perspective, it looked like these greedy capitalist countries are just throwing their money around and trying to buy people. And so they basically looked at it as a form of bribery. And then NATO was formed in 1949. We already talked about this, and it's a military alliance. But once again, consider it from the Soviet perspective. It looks like one of the old alliance systems that led to World War I and World War II. So they basically look at it as another alliance meant to start a world war. We claimed, oh, it's just to help protect each other, but the Soviets thought it was just another alliance that would lead to a world war. And then there was the blockade that was going on in the meantime. While NATO was being formed from 1948 to 49, the Berlin blockade took place. Remember that Berlin is divided, and part of it's democracy, but it's completely surrounded by communist territory. Remember how I said a lot of people wanted to move into the side that had democracy. So the Stalin and the Soviets saw that as a problem. So they decided to just take over all of Berlin. We'll just surround it completely with our military, and the democracy side will be cut off from everybody else. Of course, we actually didn't want to start World War III. So instead of having our army go through there, instead we used planes, and we just dropped supplies, not bombs. We just dropped supplies, food and other types of things for the people of Berlin. And so that was called the Berlin Airlift. Thousands of planes ended up flying over that year. One plane landed every 90 seconds at the Berlin airport. So thousands of planes. And then in 49, every person who had been afraid of the Red Scare, their worst nightmare came true. The Soviets exploded their first atomic bomb. Now, we, of course, looked at it, oh no, they're a threat. But from the Soviet perspective, they basically said, hey, this is only fair. You have them, so we should also have them. It didn't really make a lot of sense of why the United States should have a monopoly on nuclear weapons. How do we know this? Well, because they tested it when they first started out, just like we tested nuclear weapons in the Southwest desert for instance, in New Mexico. Does anybody want to take a guess how many nuclear weapons have been tested throughout human history? Well, we do have a number. It is possible to count them. It is high, though. We've tested over 2,000 altogether, all the countries that have them. So we've blown up over 2,000 nuclear weapons on Earth just within the last 60 or 70 years. Well, not for the places where that was done. There's quite a few places where no one can live for a while. A lot of them we exploded underground, though. And then, of course, the Korean War. Once again, this was part of containment. We didn't want communism to spread north, or to spread south, excuse me. The north was communist, hence the red. The south was going to be democracy. Now, the Soviets didn't get too involved. They supplied the north, and it was mostly the Chinese that helped with troops. But the United States actually had troops fighting in South Korea. In fact, there's still some of these Korean War veterans that are alive today. So the Soviets didn't get involved as much. They didn't necessarily care about it as much because they saw it as more China's problem. Because here above the border in the north is China. It's not right up against Russia. So they weren't too worried about it. But they did help by giving supplies. But they saw the military situation as a problem. So, of course, by 1955, they in turn formed the opposite of NATO, which would be the Warsaw Pact.